Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the digestive system, and we're going to start off working on the basics of how we get through the digestive system and then get into all of the organs and components of the digestive system itself. So when it comes to the digestive system, essentially we have a big long tract. So we have this big long tube that runs through the body, going from the mouth all the way down to the anus. And so this is the place where we're going to break down all of the food that we have ingested and get it into a substance that we can actually absorb. So get it down to the nutrients that we can actually bring into the body itself, get into the bloodstream, and utilize for everything that we have the needs for it in the body. The tract itself has the actual tube, so we have the actual canal itself there. That is where all the food is going to go. But then we also have some accessory types of organs that are there as well that are helping with the process of both mechanical and chemical digestion. So one big long tube going from the mouth down into the esophagus to the stomach to all of the intestines, small intestines, large intestines, and then eventually out of the body. And as we can see there, we have the alimentary canal itself, the actual tube, and then we have the individual organs that are our accessory organs, like our teeth, our salivary glands, our liver, the gallbladder, pancreas, and so on. And so all of this has the ability to help us in the digestive process. So what is that process? Essentially, it's a way that we disassemble the food that we're consuming. The food that we're taking in is essentially chemically in a relatively large component, and those larger substances need to be broken down. And so we're going to disassemble all of the nutrients that we bring in. Take larger carbohydrates, break them down into simpler carbohydrates, break down our proteins into amino acids, break down our lipids into fatty acids and lipids themselves, and then from there get all of our micronutrients that are going to come along the way. That's there. And we have to ingest the food. We have to be able to move it along the tract so that different things can happen to it along the way. So we're going to have some peristalsis along the way. We're going to mechanically mix the food, grind it up, get it into having a larger surface area for it to work on it chemically, so that we can eventually absorb it, and then whatever is left over is eliminated from the body via defecation. That's there. So different parts of the entire system itself are working on different areas of digestion itself. And so we have areas for mechanical digestion, we have areas for chemical digestion along the way. And in some places, both of them are, in a sense, kind of mixed together, that we're having both a chemical digestion and a mechanical and chemical digestion together within the same area. So places like the stomach, we're chemically breaking things down a little bit and also doing chemical digestion and mechanical digestion at the same time. That's there. But overall, the actual majority of the breakdown is happening within the small intestines, and that is where we're also doing absorption as well. And then, as I said, whatever is left over, the waste products are then eliminated as feces through defecation. So how do we do this? We go along and we have to literally take the food into the digestive tract. So we need to do ingestion. That brings the food in. From there, we're going to begin the first part of propulsion, which is swallowing. And then as we move into the tract itself, we're going to have peristaltic waves of smooth muscle contracting to move the food along in through the entire system itself. And so this is going to begin in the esophagus and continue all the way until the anal canal there. Mechanical digestion has to occur as well. We need to essentially break up the food, larger bites, into smaller components that are there so that we have more surface area. So this begins with chewing the food. It's then going to continue in the stomach as it mixes and churns the food along the way. So peristalsis is more about movement. So it's moving the food along. whereas segmentation is moving the food back and forth, more like mixing the food itself. And so peristalsis is going to begin in, say, the esophagus. So we can imagine that that upper picture is the esophagus, and it's pushing and moving the food down along in towards the stomach. And then the same process is going to continue as it moves through the intestines as well. For mixing and churning of the food itself, we need to have segmentation. And this is going to essentially squeeze the digestive tract in individual segments. And so each of these areas where we have contraction occurring, the food is getting squeezed and moved back and forth. And that eventually allows for us to essentially mix the food. So we can see where we go from beige and a dark brown, and we eventually have a light brown mixture of the foods themselves that are there. And that allows for us to not only mix the food together with digestive enzymes, but also to mix it so that it's eventually bumping up against the walls of the digestive tract so we can do absorption. That's there. Whereas with peristalsis, the contraction is a wave, and it's continuing all the way down the intestines itself. And so it's going from one spot to the next. And this is going to help us to move from one segment to the next as well. Chemical digestion is just that. We're taking chemicals and adding them into the food that we have, and it's literally breaking the food apart. And so this is a catabolic reaction. This is breaking down the food essentially into its smallest elements that are there and things that we can actually then absorb. So absorption is the goal here, to where we can actually get all of our nutrients into the bloodstream and allow us to be able to utilize that nutrient that we just absorbed. Anything that is left over is going to be defecated out as waste. And so this is going to be generally things that we cannot absorb. So we don't have the ability to digest them typically chemically. That's there. So those things are going to stay in the digestive tract and be lost as waste. This is also going to be a way that we can get rid of some of our metabolic wastes along the way as well, and we'll talk about that later on. So when it comes to the digestive tract forming, much like we've talked about with all of our other organs and organ systems, they are inside a body cavity. And so this body cavity is our peritoneal cavity. This has all of our digestive organs that are below the diaphragm, and this is an area where the majority of movement and activity is going to occur. So we need to have body coverings, and so we have visceral coverings covering the actual organs themselves. We have parietal coverings covering the body wall, and in between the two we have a tiny bit of fluid. And so this small amount of fluid that is there is going to allow for relatively friction-free movement of the digestive organs inside the abdominal cavity here, inside our peritoneal cavity. And so they're not just kind of stuck in place as far as the organs go. They do need to be able to kind of move around a little bit. That being said, when it comes to the peritoneal cavity itself, the peritoneal cavity is a little bit different from, say, the thoracic cavity, in that not everything is, in a sense, just kind of in the same spot. And so what we have is we have organs that are peritoneal and organs that are retroperitoneal. And this arises from the embryological development in terms of the organs and how they actually formed. And in that process, that takes it so that some of our organs are going to end up being peritoneal, being inside the peritoneal cavity. And so this is where we're going to have the organs themselves inside here. And some of them are going to end up being in the retroperitoneal space, lying essentially behind it on there. And so things that are inside that peritoneum, things like our stomach, our spleen, the liver, the majority of the small intestines in terms of the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and some of our colon is there as well. The transverse colon and the sigmoid colon are all within that peritoneal cavity. The organs themselves are going to, as they develop into those spaces, their blood supplies are going to be slightly different, things like that. And we're also going to end up having organs that are retroperitoneal as well. And so we're going to see that the organs themselves that are there are slightly different as far as where we find those organs being kind of smooshed against the back wall of the peritoneal cavity that's there. And so we have things like the part of the duodenum, the pancreas, the rectum, the esophagus going up a little bit further on there are all part of our retroperitoneal organs that we're going to have for the digestive tract here as well as the kidneys are smushed back in there as well. Those kind of get stuck to the posterior aspect there also, and then parts of the ascending and descending colons. And so that's where now they're in this space here, essentially against the back of the abdominal cavity there. And so if we were to go into the abdomen and look inside, we wouldn't see those retroperitoneal organs because they're going to be behind the peritoneum. So they're going to be behind the structures that are there at the posterior aspect. So when it comes to blood supply, we've talked about the blood vessels already and the supply as it goes into the abdominal cavity that's there. And so the major supplies coming off in terms of the arterial supply, we have our celiac trunk. That celiac trunk then gives rise to the blood vessels that are going to feed the stomach, the spleen, the liver, and so on. And so we have our hepatic, our splenic, our left and right gastric arteries, the arteries that are going to feed into the parts of the duodenum, and so on. And so all of that feeds into kind of the first portion of the digestive tract. We then have our inferior and superior mesenteric arteries, and these ones are going to basically finish up the majority of the rest of the tract itself. And so this is going to hit the small intestines and the large intestines as far as bringing blood into them. This blood supply here is the portion that is going to bring in blood vessels that'll eventually pick up the nutrients and head back through the hepatic portal circulation. And so this is now all of the nutrient-rich blood. It's on the venous side of the system, and this is what's now going to head over to the liver. And so this blood makes its way over to the liver, and the liver is going to have essentially its first look at the nutrients that have come in. Does it need to process any of them? Does it need to change in them? Especially things like medications, things like that. They get a first pass through the liver, and perhaps the liver starts to break them down and makes them less active. When it comes to the digestive tract, there's an abundance of types of epithelial lining the digestive tract in different places, and this varies kind of depending upon where we are. So the tract, once we enter into the esophagus and go all the way down to the anal canal, we have basically the same basic structures that are there. And so we have 4 different layers to the digestive tract called tunics. And these 4 tunics are the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. These are the layers of tissue that lie within all portions. The only difference is that they're going to change in terms of what's happening in the mucosa and the submucosa and the muscularis and so on a little bit, depending upon what the goal is of that particular section of the digestive tract. And so that's going to be the one thing that kind of changes a little bit along the way. Otherwise, it's all basically the same from beginning to end as far as the general layers themselves go. That's there. So the serosa is our outermost layer. So the portion that's been peeled back here, that is part of the serosa. That's the outermost. So if we were to look inside the abdomen, that's basically what we would see. That's there. As we make our way in, we've got a thick layer of muscle. It's actually 2 layers, and so there are 2 components to it. We have the longitudinal and the circular muscle layers. This is going to be the same all throughout the entire digestive tract except for the stomach. The stomach has an extra layer of muscle that is there as well. And when you think about the function of the stomach is essentially to mix up all the food, kind of work like a blender. It needs that extra layer of muscle in there to allow for that breakdown. So we have a transverse layer there as well. Deep to the muscularis layer, we then have a submucosa. So submucosal layer has glands and blood vessels quite a bit in there. And then we move into the epithelium. So this is our mucosal layer itself. This is the portion that is right on the inside. So if we were a piece of food kind of traveling through the digestive tract, that's the portion that we would see is the epithelial layer of the mucosa itself. It has a thin layer of muscle right in there called the muscularis mucosa as well. And again, that's going to travel all throughout the digestive tract, making its way from, again, the esophagus all the way down to the anal canal. So what's in these different layers? We have the mucosa itself. So this is our epithelial layer. This is going to change slightly again depending upon on where we are as far as the type of epithelium that is there. But this is the part where we're going to do the majority of all of our absorption along the way. So the primary job is absorption of the nutrients along the way. In some places, it's going to be more about protection. And it's going to do that through the secretion of mucus into that layer so that we have a protective lining, in a sense, along the way that is there. And within the layers themselves, we have our first layer working our way deeper in. We have the epithelial lining. And so this here is primarily simple columnar epithelium. And so we have a layer of cells. They're going to be designed for absorption along the way. They do produce mucus, especially those goblet cells. And so this is going to be that protective layer right along there. This makes it so that it doesn't irritate the tissue that's there or the lining along the way. In the stomach, we have this production of cells that are producing not only enzymes, but also those that are producing hormones. And so the organs themselves have endocrine function. We looked at some of this back when we did the endocrine system, but these are more localized hormones that are going to create different movements, different secretions of portions of the digestive tract as new things kind of come into them along the way. The lamina propria, this is our connective tissue layer that lies in between the epithelium and the muscular layer. So we have a little bit of loose areolar, some reticular connective tissue that's there. This is providing for all of the nutrition up to the epithelial layer that is there. And the blood vessels that are found in here are where we're going to start the absorptive process for those nutrients as well. Muscularis layer here, this is primarily for local movement. So meaning that this is just going to be in the small little area of the intestines or wherever it happens to be. This is not going to produce peristalsis. This is not going to produce much segmentation into the area itself. The last of the layers, we have the submucosa. Submucosa is a large amount of dense connective tissue inside there. We get some larger blood vessels. We get lymphatics into this area itself. We have part of our nervous supply that comes into the digestive tract here as well. The muscularis externa, again, this is our 2 layers, our circular layer and our longitudinal layers for the majority of the digestive tract, and then that 3rd layer into the stomach as well on those. And then the outermost covering is the serosa. So this is what we see again when we just look inside the abdomen. Beginning the digestive process, we have ingestion. For ingestion, we utilize the mouth. And so inside the cavity itself here, we have essentially the openings to the outside world, as well as getting us down into eventually the esophagus. And so through the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, the mouth is going to push that food down into the esophagus that's there. Because we're chewing, because we have teeth, because our food at this point may be relatively rough, the lining in the mouth is stratified squamous epithelium, and so this provides for an extra protective layer. This is non-keratinized for the most part, unlike the skin, so we don't have those dead cells out there. But we do have a little bit of keratinization in certain portions of the oral cavity here, simply because, again, some things are coming in and essentially bumping up against it, rubbing up against it more aggressively in areas. So we have essentially things like the gums, the hard palate, and the dorsum of the tongue all have slightly keratinized epithelium on there. So it's not completely keratinized like the skin that is there, but it does provide for extra protection, kind of where the majority of our abrasion tends to occur. And so here we have the oral cavity itself. Looking from a sectioned view here, we can see as the oral cavity comes in, food's going to come in, gets mushed up against the hard palate by the tongue itself. Our teeth chew and grind up the food, and then we push the food back into the oropharynx for initiating the swallowing reflex that's there. So as it comes into the back of the oral cavity there, our swallowing reflex is going to pass it down through the oropharynx, past the laryngopharynx, and then into the esophagus on its way towards the stomach. Another view, looking from an anterior view here, we can see the oral cavity again. That is there, and so we have our teeth, we have the tongue inside there. One of the aspects of the tongue is we do have the lingual frenulum, and so when that is too shortened there, that's where you get tongue-tied individuals on there. The tongue is two separate portions, so essentially both sides are independent of one another, so we can control both sides as well. And this allows us to push our food to the left, to the right, keep it in between our teeth, things like that, as we grind it up inside the oral cavity that's there. One of the other things that we can see here as well is we have two openings right on either side of the lingual frenulum. These are the ducts to the submandibular gland, and so those are right underneath the bottom of the tongue there. Sometimes when you do things like yawn or open your mouth wide, those may secrete, and they can actually squirt quite a long distance as well. The palate has two different portions to it. We have the hard palate, which we saw there on the last pictures. This is essentially just the underneath the palatine bones themselves is where we have the hard palate. This allows for our tongue to push our food up against the food. It's going to give some grip to it because it is essentially slightly corrugated. Think of like a dog or a cat's upper part of their mouth. It is extremely corrugated, meaning that it has little ridges in it. It's got little bumps along the top of it. And so if we were to look at it kind of a cross section, the top of our tongue looks like that. If you ever had like a retainer after braces and it had that hard plastic top part, you'd notice that on the one side, the part that actually touches the hard palate, it's rough. And so it has that roughness to it, similar to what the actual top of your mouth looks like on there. The soft palate is a little bit more posterior. So the anterior portion of the hard palate basically goes all the way up to the teeth themselves. The soft palate is more towards the posterior aspect that's there. This contains things like our uvula. It allows us to raise the soft palate, and that's going to close off the nasopharynx during swallowing so that food and liquids don't end up going up your nose. We don't want things to go where they're not supposed to there. The tongue is our manipulator for things like moving our food around. This is going to push the bolus of food back towards the back of the throat when we begin um, swallowing. So it's going to initiate the swallowing reflex. We utilize it when we speak. And so, depending upon where our tongue is in our mouth, we utilize it to make different sounds. So, we can push it up against the top of our palate, we can pull it down, we can curve it, etc. And so, it can help with the production of sounds as it goes along. The tongue is relatively large and it has two different aspects in terms of muscles. We have intrinsic muscles and then we have extrinsic muscles. Those intrinsic muscles are the ones that are, in a sense, literally inside the tongue itself in terms of their origin insertion. These muscles help to change the shape of the tongue. So this makes it a more point, makes it more blunt, things like that. The extrinsic muscles are more about positioning. Where do we put the tongue? Is it going to the left, to the right? Things like that as far as the actual movement of the tongue goes. On the tongue, one of its other functions besides manipulating food and speech is taste. And this is done through a couple of different types of what we call papillae. And so for taste, we have fungiform and circumvallate papillae. The filiform ones are just about grip. And so these ones are going to allow us to hold on to our food, things like that. And again, think to like your dog or your cat. If they've ever licked you, you know that their tongues are rough like sandpaper. Our tongues are not quite as rough. Their tongues are designed more for not having forks and knives and things like that with our food. They need to be able to grip it more, and that's where the filiform papillae come into play. They're more about the grip rather than anything else. Fungiform are found all over the surface of the tongue, much like the filiform ones are, whereas circumvallate are only towards the posterior aspect of the tongue, and they literally make this kind of V shape at the back of the tongue, and we've got anywhere between 9 and 12 or so of those different circumvallate papillae there on there. The sulcus terminalis is essentially at the end there of the circumvallate papillae, and that allows us to kind of designate the posterior aspect of the tongue that is there. The majority of the tongue is in the oral cavity, but 1/3 of the tongue is actually all the way back in the oral pharynx. So again, the tongue is a relatively large structure that we have. And so 2/3 of the tongue in front, 1/3 of the tongue in back on there. And here we can see those filiform papillae, large, kind of look almost like scales. The fungiform papillae and the circumvallate papillae are there for taste, not for functional movement, things like that on the tongue. And again, we can see how the circumvallate papillae make kind of like a V shape at the back of the tongue. Our oral cavity needs to be kept moist. So we don't have really keratinized cells to protect from drying out. That's there. So that's part of the process of moisture kept into the oral cavity. It also helps to clean the mouth. So it's going to, as we salivate after meals, things like that, it's going to rinse things down as it goes. It helps to moisten our food. It helps to get the chemicals from our food into solution so that we can actually taste it. That's there. And then, especially if something is more on the drier side, it's going to help in creating this bolus that we can actually swallow down. The one chemical digestion that we begin here is through the release of salivary amylase, and that's going to help to break down starches. So that's going to be coming from our saliva itself. 3 different glands. We have our parotid gland, our submandibular gland, and our sublingual glands that we have for the production of saliva. The parotid glands are the largest of the glands themselves. These ones lie basically right in front of your ear, kind of along the angle of the jaw there, right on the front aspect there. They have a relatively long duct, which extends all the way into the oral cavity, and emerges at the second molar on the upper side. So this is coming right into the side of the jaw there. The submandibular ones are under the angle of the mandible itself as well, running along the bottom of the tongue essentially. And again, its duct is relatively long, and as we said before, it comes out at either side of the lingual frenulum for each one. So we have paired glands. There's one on either side for each. The sublingual glands basically run along the base of the tongue, and have little openings all along the floor of the mouth there, on either side, all there for lubrication of the oral cavity inside there. So as our teeth come back, there would be our second molar, our third molar, and our first molar, and right about there is where the parotid duct itself opens up. That's there. The sublingual glands have little tiny openings along the base of the tongue, and then there we have the opening of the submandibular gland. They are glands. The ducts themselves can get blocked up, and when that happens in the parotid gland, we get what we call parotitis, and that's going to lead to essentially the whole parotid gland swelling and becoming inflamed. It's going to be very tender. When this is caused by infection from the myxovirus, we get mumps, but it can also be due to essentially something being blocked in the duct itself, and it can happen just simply as a person eats. What's inside the saliva? The majority of it, water. So the majority of what we find inside there is water itself, but it also has other components like that of the plasma. So we have different electrolytes that we can find there. Our one digestive enzyme, we have salivary amylase to start to break down things. That's our major nutrient that we start to break down at that point. And so this is for starch breakdown. Different types of proteins that we can find there, part of our immune response to things that may be happening inside the oral cavity there. And then just like other glands like sweat glands and things, some metabolic wastes in there as well. When we salivate, normally, in a sense, we're doing so basically just to keep the mouth moist. But other factors can lead to the production of saliva as well. This can be the thought of food, this can be the smell of food, things like that, starting to eat, chewing, all adds to an external or extrinsic salivary production of saliva itself. That's there, on there. The sympathetic nervous system is going to shut this down. And so if somebody is in a fight or flight mode, they're going to have oftentimes a dry mouth that goes along with it because it's essentially shutting down digestion. Mentioned parotitis. I wanted to do that on the picture before so that we could kind of see where it is there. But it is caused by a viral infection. So this is where the mumps vaccine comes into play to defend against that. Otherwise, it does cause swelling of the gland itself. It can be on one side only. It can be on both sides as far as the infection itself goes. When somebody has parotitis that is not related to the mumps itself, it'll oftentimes be exacerbated by sour tasting foods, so acidic types of foods that they may be ingesting, and that causes the gland to start to try and secrete. Left untreated, parotitis has the potential to cause infertility in men because the virus will end up attacking the testes as well. And next time around, we will continue on into the digestive tract and make our way down in through the esophagus and into the stomach.